tough is it going to be, do you think, to get this report? Barr's version of a full report might just be a little different than what the Democrats are wanting.
Yeah, I definitely think that this is why you're seeing everyone sort of trying to get it, and all these committees trying to get their hands on it, because I think, you know, what has been indicated is that there's going to be so much redacted in the report, and Democrats want to read between the lines, want to know what's in those redactions, and so they're going to do anything possible to get their hands on the full report, and that's why they're going to bring in all these Comey and Mueller. They're going to subpoena them to find out exactly what is in there.
Yeah, so without a doubt, the most hotly debated piece of this report, Greg, is Mueller not making a decision on obstruction and Barr making the decision instead. So that's question number one for Congress when they get him there. What do you want to hear from Bill Barr?
Well, there was always going to be an intense interest on the part of Congress to see the complete report. Sunday's letter from the AG only created more confusion and has amplified the desire on the part of Congress to see the details. The letter was confusing for two reasons. One, it suggests, and it's not clear, but it suggests that the special counsel did not make the final call on the obstruction issue and instead punted, as we've been saying, to the Attorney General. So that doesn't quite make sense. And then secondly, what also doesn't make sense is that if the special counsel is going to punt any issue to one of the political appointees, and specifically the Attorney General, why the obstruction issue, which is something that the Attorney General had been criticized for because of the memo he wrote last year. So there's a lot of explaining to do. It's going to take, I think, a hearing, probably including the AG, the Deputy Attorney General, and the special counsel, and a production of the report.
Yeah, and Doug, beyond that, because we know Barr has already said, apparently, if you listen to Jerry Nadler, I'll answer your questions, but how key is it to hear from Bob Mueller directly?
Well, that's going to be a legal dust-up, and I'm not so sure how that's going to play out. I mean, if the Attorney General, Bill Barr, said he's going to go in, so that'll happen. But the person who actually was special counsel, I'm not so sure.
I mean, does technically he still work for Bill Barr?
No, now that the special counsel investigation is wrapped up. But working off of Greg's point, I mean, again, just to repeat, the key thing is after having made the decision with respect to collusion, they then say in the letter, the special counsel didn't engage in the normal DOJ analysis on this issue, which is puzzling and confusing. So they're going to need to drill down, as Greg said, on that.
Brian, in your new cover story, it's about how the president, quote, beat the Mueller investigation. And yet, as we've seen today, he's already moved on to health care. He's moved on to the southern border. He's even talking about Jussie Smollett. What is your assessment? And by the way, amazing cover there. What's your assessment of why that's happening? If you have a winning hand, why would you fold?
Well, he feels like he is trying to play out some of the political capital that he feels like he has now that the Mueller investigation is wrapped up. I mean, of course, we are reliant on Barr and Barr's description of what's in the Mueller report right now for that. But we know that there won't be any more indictments coming out of Mueller's office, that work is done. And so the president is trying to bring up other issues that he thinks are going to be winning issues for him. Of course, health care, you can argue that is not a winning issue. In fact, Democrats are happy to be talking about health care because they think that really resonates with their voters. So we're going to have to see how the president plays this out and what he decides to do now that this sort of Damocles that had been hanging over his head for so long has been removed. And we're going to have to see how that plays out with what details and information are in the Mueller report. But the fact is, Mueller's closed up shop and there aren't any more indictments coming out of that office.
Yeah, certainly one way, Mike, to read this, all these tweets this morning is this, here's a laundry list of what he says I'm going to do now that I feel like I've got the wind at my back. But one that stuck out to me, I don't want to go through all of them, is the Adam Schiff tweet where he basically said, if you lie and you're a politician, you should resign. Yeah. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, the Washington Post fact checker has found 9,000 plus instances of this president either lying or misleading.
Yeah, Daniel Dale has almost 5,000 and he vets every single word. He's fantastic, of the Toronto Star. Just a couple things. And the Trump re-election campaign put out a list of elected officials who came on this network and other places and said absolutely factual things, normally with the phrase, but we got to see what the special counsel finds. And the re-election campaign says, don't invite invite them back, vet them. It's just anti-American. I will say that I see no reason. I mean, if I had to play this out from a game theory standpoint, it seems that a large portion of the Mueller report has to come out because Mueller knows what's in the report and he will talk before Congress. Barr knows that Mueller will talk before Congress. It's in Mueller's interest not to give away state secrets or talk about the grand jury, but he wants to say what he found. Barr knows that, and therefore Barr is going to at least be motivated to disclose the vast majority of the Mueller report, except for some maybe fine details about national security. I would think that has to be how it happens.
Greg, last night we saw the president doing something that he has done before. And, you know, to your point about the reelect campaign sending out this note saying, here's the people you shouldn't have on your air anymore. He essentially tick-tocked through what somebody might call an enemies list. Listen.
Comey, who's a terrible guy, Comey and McCabe and Strzok and Page, the lover Page, and all of these people, they've admitted in testimony that there was no crime. Brennan lied. Many of these people lied to Congress. I think Brennan's a sick person. I really do. I believe there's something wrong with him. Schiff is a bad guy because he knew he was lying. I mean, he's not a dummy. I heard they should force him off the committee or off the committee chair. He should be forced out of office.
Greg, I'm sure you noticed he mentioned your former boss, Jim Comey. I thought, you know what, when Richard Nixon's enemies list came out, people were just, you know, stunned. And I pulled this line out of it. It said, how we can use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. What a difference this presidency makes. He doesn't have some secret list somewhere. He comes out and talks about it very openly.
Yeah, it's another bizarre series of comments by the president. And I think most observers would say what the president is saying is absolutely not true. But you don't have to believe most observers. I think if the president simply asked his own Attorney General Bill Barr, his own Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, his own FBI Director Chris Wray, I think each of them would say that none of what he is saying about the FBI, about Jim Comey, about Brennan, about anyone else is accurate. And so it's just another bizarre series of comments. I would also, let me say, if I could, Chris, real quickly, that I would respectfully disagree that the sword has been removed from over the president's head. There are two big things to watch going forward that could create significant liability for the president. One is the other investigations that are still pending in the Southern District of New York, the case brought by the Manhattan District Attorney and others. And the second issue, of course, is that the Mueller report, when we finally do see it, could be a very, very detailed indictment, not in the classic legal sense, but in terms of accusations of misconduct against the president, that is very, very damaging to the president. Until we see that, it would be wise for the president and his supporters to not spike the football in the end zone.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.